Introduction: The Forbidden Roman Water Trick. Picture this. It is January 19th, 2026. You wake up, turn on the news, and within seconds, the calm of your morning fractures. A massive 72-inch sewer interceptor has just collapsed 5 miles upstream from Washington, D.C. And over the next few days, nearly 300 million gallons of raw, untreated sewage surge into the Potomac River. More water than the entire tidal basin can hold. E. coli levels explode to 12,000 times the safe limit. The river turns toxic. The system fails in real time. And then a harder question hits you. How does the most technologically advanced civilization in human history end up drowning in its own waste, crippled by infrastructure that collapses without warning? Yet 2,000 years ago, an ancient empire solved this exact problem. While our grids strain and break, their aqueducts, built by men in sandals and linen, are still delivering clear water today, without electricity, without chlorine, and without a single mechanical pump. Welcome back to Historia Prime. Today we uncover the lost hydro-engineering secret the Romans quietly perfected, the Piscina Limaria. A passive purification system so elegant, so far ahead of its time, that modern engineers in 2026 are urging us to bring it back. And by the end of this video, you will see how this forgotten trick can protect your home, your community, and your survival, especially in a world where pumps fail, grids falter, and clean water can disappear overnight. So take a breath, steady your mind, and buckle up, because we are about to travel 2 millennia into the past to rediscover the Roman water trick that should never have been forgotten. Part 1. The Illusion of Modern Superiority. Before we can understand the brilliance of ancient Rome, we have to face an uncomfortable truth about our own age. We tend to believe that because we live in the 21st century, our systems must be superior. Yet the evidence around us tells a very different story. Take the Potomac disaster of 2026. A pipe built in 1962 barely survived 6 decades before collapsing in on itself. In Jackson, Mississippi, families open their taps to find rust-colored water laced with sediment. And in Atlanta, a city bursting with growth, dozens of water mains rupture every single month because the pipes beneath the streets are literally disintegrating. These failures expose a deeper flaw in modern thinking. Our entire water network is built on pressure, on forcing water through miles of metal, using pumps that depend on fragile electrical grids. But when a high-pressure system breaks, it does not fail gently. One outage, one corroded joint, one targeted cyber attack, and suddenly millions of people lose access to something as basic as drinkable water. So let's step back 2,000 years, across the Mediterranean, into a world without electricity, without industrial machinery, and without chemical treatment plants. At its height, Rome was a city of over 1 million people, yet its aqueducts moved nearly 250 million gallons of clean water into the capital every day. The scale rivals modern cities, and the Romans achieved it not by overpowering nature, but by cooperating with it. Their entire system was built on gravity, flow, and patience. They slowed water down instead of forcing it. They guided it instead of fighting it. And that simple shift in philosophy, working with nature, not against it, is the reason their water systems outlasted empires, while ours struggled to survive a single lifetime. Part 2. The Magic of the Piscina Limaria. To understand how Rome kept its water so clean, we have to begin with a structure that looks deceptively simple. The Romans called it the Piscina Limaria, a name that sounds humble, almost unimpressive, translating to silt pool or settling tank. Yet this quiet piece of engineering was the beating heart of Rome's purification system, a device so elegant that anyone seeing it for the first time might mistake it for magic. But there was no magic here, only physics, geometry, and a level of patience almost unimaginable today. These settling chambers were placed with surgical precision along Rome's aqueducts, near the water source, before dangerous valley crossings, and again just outside the city walls. Each one served as a moment of calm in a long, rushing journey. Roman engineers understood something fundamental about water. When you give it space, it reveals its secrets. As water races through a narrow channel, it drags mud, grit, and debris along with it. But the moment it enters the wide, open chamber of a Piscina Limaria, everything changes. The cross-sectional area expands, the velocity drops, turbulence dissolves into stillness, and in that stillness, gravity steps forward to do the work. What modern science now calls Stokes' law, the natural settling of particles, was simply common sense to the Romans. Heavy particles sink, murky water becomes clear. But they didn't stop at that basic insight. They refined it with remarkable finesse. Water always entered from the top, gliding in gently so it would not disturb the layers of sediment collecting at the bottom. The most advanced aqueducts, like the legendary Aqua Virgo, went even further. They used 4 separate chambers arranged like a purification gauntlet. The water had to weave from basin to basin, each step removing finer particles than the last, until what remained was almost impossibly clear. Even the outlet was a masterpiece of practical design. Positioned halfway up the chamber wall, it sat perfectly between 2 dangers, below the floating scum at the surface, yet well above the dense sludge on the floor. Only the cleanest, most clarified water was allowed to continue its journey toward Rome. And maintenance? The Romans built that into the design as naturally as breathing. A deeper central trough collected the settled sludge. Workers could divert the flow, drain a single chamber, scrape the basin clean, and restart the system, all without shutting down the city's water supply. No pumps, no chemicals, no electricity. Just gravity, flowing water, and geometry honed over centuries. What looks like a simple stone room was, in reality, a precision instrument, a passive purification engine, a structure that turned the laws of nature into public health. And 2,000 years later, it still works. Part 3. The secret ingredients: charcoal and sand. Now at this point, you might be wondering, settling mud is impressive, but what about the dangers we can't see? The invisible toxins, the bacteria, the microscopic threats that modern treatment plants fight with chemicals and ultraviolet light. Surely the Romans couldn't handle that, right? This is where the story becomes astonishing, because archaeology is now revealing that Rome was using filtration methods we long assumed were modern inventions. Think about the water filter in your kitchen. Inside it sits activated carbon, our proud 21st century solution for trapping chemicals and improving taste. Yet 2,000 years ago, Roman engineers were already using its ancient ancestor, crushed charcoal. At the Agios Mama spring on Crete, archaeologists discovered terracotta infiltration vessels tightly packed with charcoal. These weren't decorative containers, they were deliberate purification tools. Charcoal has a massive surface area, invisible to the naked eye, but powerful enough to attract impurities through a process known as adsorption. Organic toxins cling to it like metal to a magnet. Roman medical texts, drawing from Greek and even older Sanskrit traditions, noted that charcoal could remove foul tastes and odors from water. In other words, they knew exactly what they were doing, and charcoal was only the beginning. Across the Mediterranean, in the ancient city of Sirte, today in Algeria, explorers found something equally remarkable: an aqueduct channel partially blocked by a calculated wall of sandbags. And immediately behind that wall were 8 narrow channels lined with fine white sand. This wasn't a collapse, it was a design. That angled barrier slowed the flow. The sand trapped particles too fine to settle in the Piscina Limaria. But something even more extraordinary happens when water runs through fine sand for long periods. A thin biological layer forms at the surface, a living film modern engineers call a Schmutzdecker. It is sticky, it is active, and it consumes harmful bacteria and pathogens. Without even knowing microbiology existed, the Romans had created a primitive Biosand filter, one of the most reliable, low-tech purification systems used in developing regions today. And as if that weren't enough, they supercharged their filtration with air. Throughout their underground aqueducts, they built vertical shafts called lumina, openings that allowed water to breathe. As the stream met fresh oxygen, organic matter oxidized, anaerobic bacteria died, and the water emerged tasting brighter, cleaner, more alive. So think about this for a moment. 2,000 years ago, in an age without electricity, microscopes, or chemical theory, Roman engineers were settling solids, filtering toxins, encouraging biological purification, and oxidizing water with aeration. They were performing the essential steps of 20th century water treatment. In the year 50 AD, and they did it not through guesswork, but through observation, iteration, and an unwavering respect for the way nature purifies itself. Let that sink in, because the deeper we go into Roman engineering, the more it feels as though we're rediscovering knowledge humanity should never have forgotten. Part 4. The Immortal Architecture, the Self-Healing Concrete. A brilliant filtration system means nothing if the pipes carrying that water crumble around it. And that brings us straight back to the failures haunting modern cities, from the ruptured mains in Atlanta to the catastrophic collapse along the Potomac. Our ductile iron rusts, our steel corrodes, our Portland cement dries, cracks, and begins its slow march toward failure the moment it meets time and moisture. So the question becomes unavoidable. Why are Roman aqueducts still standing? Why does the Pont du Gard rise in perfect arches after 2,000 years of storms, earthquakes, and erosion? And how is it possible that the Aqua Virgo still feeds the Trevi fountain today, long after the civilization that built it disappeared? For centuries, this baffled researchers. Roman concrete, or opus caementicium, behaved like a material outside the rules, a substance that refused to age the way modern concrete does. It wasn't until 2023 that a team of international scientists finally discovered the secret. Under high-powered microscopes, they saw tiny white fragments embedded throughout Roman concrete. For decades, experts dismissed these pieces, called lime clasts, as evidence of sloppy work, imperfect mixing, human error. But the Romans were not sloppy. They were precise. Those white clasts were intentional. The Romans heated volcanic ash, or pozzolana, with quicklime at extremely high temperatures. That process created lime clasts that, when exposed to water, became reactive. When a hairline crack formed in the concrete, whether from an earthquake, shifting soil, or natural aging, water slipped into the fracture. In our modern materials, that would be the beginning of the end. But in Roman concrete, water triggered something miraculous. The lime clasts dissolved. They saturated the crack with calcium-rich fluid, and almost instantly, that fluid crystallized into new calcium carbonate, literally growing fresh mineral inside the wound. The concrete stitched itself shut. The structure healed. Water, the destroyer of our pipes, became the weapon that protected theirs. While modern nations spend billions tearing up streets to replace pipes that barely last 50 years, Rome built infrastructure that continually repaired microscopic damage on its own, a water network that survived the rise and fall of empires, a material that aged in reverse. And this wasn't magic. It was engineering rooted in observation, chemistry, volcanology, and the humility to work with nature instead of fighting it. 2,000 years later, our concrete still cracks. Theirs still endures. Part 5. The Forbidden Knowledge and the Dark Ages. If Roman engineering was so advanced, so efficient, and so durable that parts of it still work today, Then how did we lose it? Why did something so practical, so life-saving, fade into legend and eventually earn the title of forbidden? The truth begins with human nature, bends through politics, and finally shatters under the weight of a collapsing empire. In ancient Rome, water was not merely a resource, it was power. Whoever controlled the water controlled the people. That responsibility fell to the curator aquarum, an official whose authority overshadowed that of many senators. Under his rule, only the emperor, the elite, and the great public baths enjoyed steady access to the highest quality water delivered through the aqueducts. And where power concentrates, corruption follows. Illegal tapping became rampant. Wealthy landowners and opportunistic officials punched secret holes into the aqueduct walls, connecting them with narrow lead pipes that drained public water into private estates. Some used it to feed ornamental fountains, others poured it into lush personal gardens, while ordinary citizens waited at public fountains for their daily supply. The theft became so widespread that in 184 BC, Cato the Elder launched a merciless campaign to hunt down these illicit taps. Crews marched along the aqueducts with hammers and chisels, smashing every unauthorized pipe they found. Rome treated water engineering the same way modern nations treat nuclear secrets. Highly guarded, fiercely protected, and punishable by the harshest penalties. And in Rome, the harshest penalty was not death. It was aquae et igni interdictio, the removal of water and fire. To lose access to water was to lose your citizenship, your home, and your right to exist. Yet the real tragedy did not come from corruption. It came from war. In the year 537 AD, during the Gothic War, the Ostrogoths laid siege to Rome. They knew the aqueducts were the arteries of the city, so they attacked them directly. Arch after arch, channel after channel, they broke the lifelines that carried fresh water into the capital. And with the empire fractured, there were no longer trained engineers to rebuild them, nor a stable government capable of maintaining the massive crews required to clean the settling basins and repair the concrete. What followed was not a slow decline, it was a technological blackout. The Piscina Limaria filled with stagnant water and sludge. The knowledge of sand filtration faded from memory. The chemistry of self-healing concrete disappeared. And Europe, once fueled by engineering sophistication, returned to drinking from polluted rivers and shallow wells teeming with disease. For nearly 1,000 years, the world suffered outbreaks of cholera, dysentery, and waterborne plagues, ills the Romans had already solved. It wasn't until the 19th century that a Scottish engineer, John Gibb, created the first large-scale sand filter, unknowingly reinventing principles Rome had mastered 15 centuries earlier. An empire fell, and with it, an entire science vanished. Water ceased to be guided, slowed, purified, and respected. It became something people feared, something that carried death. And the saddest part is that the ancient solution was never truly lost. It was simply buried under the ruins of a world that no longer understood what it once knew. Part 6. Survival 101. Building your own Roman filter. History is only powerful when we allow it to guide us, and today that guidance is more urgent than ever. Our modern water grid, this vast, pressurized electrical web we depend on, is far more fragile than we would like to admit. Ask the residents of Jackson, Mississippi, who watched their taps run brown for weeks. Ask anyone whose city has been struck by a cyber attack, a power outage, or a mainline collapse. When the system fails, help does not arrive instantly, and polluted rivers will not save you. Which is why every household should understand the Roman water trick, not as a curiosity of the ancient world, but as a practical survival tool. Because if the grid ever goes silent, a passive Roman filter can turn undrinkable mud into clear, boilable water using nothing more than gravity, time, and the principles hidden inside the Piscina Limaria. So let's walk through it, step by step. First, You'll need a clean container, something as simple as a 5-gallon bucket or a plastic drum. At the very bottom, make a small drainage hole. This is where your purified water will eventually drip out. Next comes the foundation. Add 2 to 3 inches of coarse, washed gravel. It may look insignificant, but this layer keeps finer materials from escaping through the hole and provides a clean channel where the filtered water can collect before exiting. Above the gravel sits the active layer, 4 to 6 inches of crushed hardwood charcoal. Not barbecue briquettes, not anything soaked in lighter fluid, just natural charcoal. This layer acts exactly like the activated carbon in modern filters. Its microscopic pores grab toxins, absorb chemicals, and strip away the foul tastes that often betray unclean water. Then comes the mechanical layer. Add 6 to 8 inches of fine, washed sand. This is your personal settling basin, your miniature Piscina Limaria. Mud, silt, and sediment become trapped in its upper layers. And if you keep using the filter for a few weeks, something remarkable happens. A thin biological film forms at the surface. We've seen it before, the Schmutzdecker. It quietly consumes harmful bacteria, performing a kind of natural purification the Romans used without ever naming it. When it's time to use the filter, pour your collected water gently onto the sand. Don't dump it in violently. Respect the layers. Let gravity guide the flow downward. The sand catches the sediment. The charcoal captures toxins. The gravel channels the cleansed water out through the bottom. What emerges will look clean, astonishingly clean, compared to what went in. Yet, in a true survival scenario, clarity is not the same as safety. Always boil this water for at least 1 minute before drinking to eliminate modern pathogens the Romans never had to face. But understand this clearly. By following these ancient principles, you have just transformed a bucket of filthy water into something life-saving. You've recreated a lost technology that sustained 1 million people in the ancient world, without electricity, without pumps, and without chemicals. In a crisis, this knowledge is not trivia. It is resilience. It is independence. It is the difference between waiting helplessly for aid and taking control of your survival the way Romans did 2,000 years ago. Part 7. The Awakening. Modern cities return to Rome. For all the failures of our modern water systems, there is one hopeful truth emerging from the chaos. The world's best engineers are finally looking backward to move forward. In the middle of overflowing sewers, collapsing pipes, and aging grids, they are rediscovering a philosophy Rome understood instinctively. That water behaves best when you slow it down, let it breathe, and allow nature to do the work we keep trying to replace with machinery. And nowhere is this shift more visible than in Atlanta. For decades, Atlanta has battled catastrophic flooding and chronic sewage overflows. Old pipes burst under pressure. Stormwater races through neighborhoods with nowhere to go. And yet, instead of responding with more steel, more pumps, and more concrete, the city made an extraordinary decision. Using $14 million in environmental impact bonds, they began building something that would have made a Roman engineer smile. Constructed wetlands and vegetated stormwater planters woven directly into the community. A constructed wetland may sound modern, but at its core, it is the same idea that powered the Piscina Limaria 2,000 years ago. Instead of forcing dirty water into a high-pressure pipe, where every surge becomes a potential disaster, the wetland spreads that water out across a broad, shallow landscape. As it slows, suspended particles settle naturally. Gravity removes the rest, and the roots of plants act like living filters, absorbing nutrients, trapping sediment, and breaking down pollutants before the water gently re-enters the ecosystem. It is passive, it is resilient, and it works with the environment instead of fighting it. The wetlands in Atlanta are not just infrastructure, they are memory. They are a reminder that Rome solved these problems long before our grids were invented, and that the key to stability was never raw force. It was deceleration. And that is the awakening happening now. Cities are realizing that the Roman trick was never truly forbidden. It was simply forgotten in our rush toward complexity. But as the pressure grows, as the failures mount, and as communities demand systems that do not break every generation, we are beginning to return to the oldest solution of all. Slow the water, guide it, let nature help, because the future of clean water might not depend on new inventions at all. It might depend on our willingness to remember what an ancient empire tried to teach us. Conclusion: the final lesson of Rome's water mastery. The story of Roman water engineering is, at its core, a reminder of two truths: how easily human pride can blind us, and how extraordinary our potential becomes when we work with nature instead of against it. The Potomac spill of 2026, the rust-stained taps of Jackson, and the ruptured mains of Atlanta all point to the same reality. Technology means nothing if it cannot endure. Rome endured because its engineers embraced patience. They designed systems meant to outlive generations. They treated water not as an opponent to be forced through pipes, but as a living force to be guided. They slowed it, gave it space, allowed it to settle and cleanse itself, and in doing so, they built infrastructure that survived long after their empire fell. As we step into a future shaped by climate shocks and aging grids, perhaps the smartest move isn't to invent something new, but to look 2,000 years backward, to ask ourselves whether we've truly advanced, or simply traded understanding for dependence on machines we barely comprehend. If this journey into Rome's forgotten genius sparked something for you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into the hidden engineering of the ancient world, make sure to like the video, subscribe to Historia Prime, and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. Stay curious, stay prepared, and always remember, the past isn't gone, it's waiting to be rediscovered.